All right, so today is lecture 2 of Unit 4. For upcoming assignments, of course, we have the Macrobiodiversity Lab today, so get that in by 11 p.m. And then the Evolution Writings assignment is due by tomorrow at the end of the day. And we'll have Homework 1 due by Monday, and that'll go online later today. So today we're going to be covering taxonomy, macrobiodiversity, and then of course we have the lab. So taxonomy is just basically a classification system. And so we have, it's a way of sorting species into these various groups that classify them based on a number of similarities. And so the taxonomy system uses this basic hierarchy of classification that starts with domain, then goes through kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And so each organism basically is sorted into each one of these categories. And so this is a fox here, red fox. Its genus species is vulpes, and then going up through the hierarchy, it's sorted into the family Canidae, order Carnivora, class Mammalia, phylum Chordata, kingdom Animalia, and domain Eukarya. And so each individual organism will fit into one of these categories. And so an acronym to remember this, something like dumb kingfil caught one fat giant squid. You can come up with your own, but that's probably a pretty easy one to remember it by. And so a taxon is a unit of classification used to define one or more populations of organisms. So each of these is a taxon. It's just kind of this arbitrary unit, right, that we use to classify organisms. And so Chordata, in this case, for example, is a taxon, as is Carnivora, as is Vulpes, as is domain, actually, in kingdom and phylum. So each of these are example of a taxon, or the plural is taxa. So it's just kind of this arbitrary unit that we use to place similar organisms into groups at various levels. So coming back to the three domains of life, we have bacteria, archaea, and eukaryota. And so this system was actually proposed in 1990 by Carl Weiss to replace the previous 5 or 6 kingdom system. So it's interesting, actually. I remember when I was in grade school, I was taught the kingdom system. That we went straight from kingdom, phylum, class. We didn't actually learn about the domains of life. And so the reason that this actually became popular is because what Carl Weiss and a couple other labs were doing was basically sequencing was beginning to become a little bit more of an applicable tool. And so what people were realizing was that the 16S ribosomal RNA of different species, a lot of microbes actually had more similarities within separate groups. And so this was a way of placing basically not all microbes together, because it was realized that some microbes were actually much more similar to eukaryotic organisms. And then, of course, the bacteria and archaea were clearly two separate evolutionary groups. So one thing I wanted to point out just on this tree of life is that when we've talked about kind of biodiversity so far, and when we think about biodiversity, probably a lot of what we're thinking about is animals, right? But animals are actually just, a very small representation of the biodiversity that's out there. And that's also illustrated here in this figure 1 of this paper that's called A New View of the Tree of Life from 2016. And so this paper actually considered all of the whole genome sequencing that's been done to date. And so basically what you can appreciate here is that the bacteria are shown all up here in this large group. The bacteria are much more diverse than either archaea or eukaryotes by quite a high degree. So within bacteria, there are 92 phyla, whereas in archaea, there are only 26 phyla, and then there are only 5 eukaryotic supergroups. So again, bacterial diversification is one of the major features of this figure. So today we're going to be covering macrobiodiversity, all of which is in the domain eukaryote. And so macrobiodiversity, what we mean by that is basically just organisms that can be observed with the unaided eye. So again, eukaryotes, the eukaryotic domain contains all macrobiodiversity, although not all eukaryotes are multicellular organisms. So within the eukaryotic domain, there are 4 major kingdoms, which are Animalia, Plantae, Fungi, and Protista. So today we're going to focus on Animalia, Plantae, and fungi because these are the ones with macrobiodiversity. So characteristics that are shared by all eukaryotes. So eukaryotes, again, include a wide range of organisms from single-celled protozoa and algae to fungi, plants, and animals. And so all of these share some cellular characteristics. One of these is that they all have a plasma membrane or a cell membrane, which is actually different from a cell wall. So not all eukaryotes have a cell wall. Some do, but all have a plasma membrane. All of them have a cytoskeleton, which is composed of microtubules and filaments. They also have membrane-bound organelles, which includes, things like the Golgi apparatus, the endoplasmic reticulum, and the mitochondria. Of course, all eukaryotic cells have mitochondria, which we talked about is, considered to be a fusion of an ancient cell and an ancient bacterial symbiote that actually led to this separate domain of life. And then all eukaryotes have a nucleus with linear chromosomes. So this is kind of what the eukaryotic cell looks like. We have a nucleus, DNA, ribosomes. We have these membrane-bound organelles. And then you can see here drawn in the lines what they're calling the cytoskeleton. And so this is what that actually kind of looks like. So here is basically a microscopy image of a cell with stained cytoskeletal proteins. So they're probably staining tubulin here, maybe also actin. And so this is what the cytoskeleton actually looks like, these long, kind of spindly microtubules and filaments. Okay, so before we actually jump into the macrobiodiversity kingdoms, I just wanted to mention that I'm kind of just going to be reading off the slides here. So if you want to skip this part and go straight to the macrobiodiversity lab, if that's easier, that's fine. Just use this lecture and the macrobiodiversity specimen slides. So that's under today's folder to complete the lab report. So there's going to be a bunch of pictures of different specimens from animals, plants, and fungi. And so you'll answer questions about those. And you can also use the upcoming slides in this lecture to help you fill that out as well. Okay, so going into the kingdom Animalia. So what are animals? Animals are multicellular eukaryotes. They don't have chlorophyll, and they also lack cell walls. Most animals are free-moving, and they are heterotrophic. And so their nutrition is primarily based on ingestion, so eating other organisms. Animals have sexual reproduction, and their growth will stop once they reach adulthood. So there are 9 major groups within Animalia. So these are the sponges, cnidarians, flatworms, annelids, mollusks, roundworms, arthropods, echinoderms, and chordates. So all of most of the animals that we generally think about, which are vertebrate animals, actually fall under chordates. So you can see that chordates are actually a very small portion of all the animals that exist on Earth. So most animals have bilateral symmetry, which means, if you cut them in half, then both sides are more or less identical. So you can think about, if you cut obviously a human in half, it's a bit morbid, but they'd look, pretty much the same on either side. But that wouldn't be true, front and back. And so cnidarians are the only animal that tend to have this radial symmetry, which means kind of like any way you slice them in half, they're going to look the same on either side. And then sponges are a bit separate from other animals because sponges actually don't have any true organs. They just kind of have tissue level of organization. So here are these 9 major phyla again. We have, porifera, which are sponges. You can think that's easy to remember because of pore in it. And of course, sponges have a lot of pores. There's mollusca, the mollusks, which include clams, snails, and octopus, squids, etc. Cnidaria, which these are the ones that, any way you cut them, they're going to look the same on either half. And so this includes coral, anemones, and jellyfish. So sort of these, round structured organisms, generally with tentacles, and they're going to look the same any way you cut them. Platyhelminths, which are flatworms, so these include flukes and planarians. They're the nematodes, which includes roundworms. Annelids, which are segmented worms, like earthworms and leeches. And then arthropods, which includes insects, arachnids, and crustaceans. And so arthropods are actually the by far the biggest phyla within Animalia. Echinoderms, which have radial symmetry, so these include starfish, sand dollars, and sea cucumbers, and then the chordates, which we fall under, so mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish. So all vertebrate species fall within this chordata phyla. And basically, this is probably, the one that we think about the most when we think about biodiversity and kind of animal species. So in the phylum Porifera, which includes sponges, some of the characteristics of sponges include they're multicellular, they don't have a whole lot of tissues, and they actually have no true organs. Sponges are immobile and they're filter feeders, and they mostly live in marine environments, and they have no definite symmetry. So you can't really cut a sponge in any particular way and expect it to look the same on either side. And so sponges, coming back to this this tree here, sponges have their own separate branch here because tissues evolved in this common ancestor between all these 8 other groups here. Okay, so moving on to mollusks. Characteristics of mollusks, they have an organ system. Most of them have either an internal or external shell. Then they have a muscular foot and or tentacles. So you can think about, the way a slug walks. It kind of has this muscular foot that it slides along on, whereas species like an octopus have tentacles. They have bilateral symmetry, as well as a soft body, which is unsegmented, and they have an open circulatory system. Okay, moving on to cnidarians. So they have radial symmetry and specialized tissues, but they don't have true organ systems. All cnidarians are aquatic, and most of them are marine, meaning, ocean-based. And they have tentacles and a circle around the mouth. So this is something to make it pretty easy to distinguish them. So 2 things here, 2 major characteristics that you can use to identify cnidaria are their radial symmetry and the tentacles and a circle around their mouth. Okay, platyhelminths now are the flatworms, and so these have bilateral symmetry, and a couple important characteristics to kind of distinguish these from other worms, because there are basically 3 groups of worms. One is that they're unsegmented, and the other is that they're flat. They also have a soft body. They do have organ systems with a central nervous system. Their reproduction, they're hermaphroditic, meaning that each worm is both sexes. And they can live basically anywhere. They live in the ocean, in freshwater, or on land. Okay, moving on to nematodes. So nematodes have bilateral symmetry, and one way to distinguish them from flatworms is that they're cylindrical, so they're roundworms. These worms are unsegmented, which is a way to distinguish them from the annelids. They have organ systems, including a central nervous system. They live pretty much anywhere, and then some of these worms are going to be parasitic, whereas some are free-living. So I don't know if you guys have heard of C. elegans. It's a commonly used model organism, basically, and that's part of this phylum. So it's used for a lot of experimentation. Then we have the annelids, which include earthworms and leeches. So again, annelids have bilateral symmetry and they're cylindrical. And these worms, the best way to distinguish them from the other is that they're segmented. So you can see these, you can see these segments here. So they have a true body cavity, and each of their segments actually contains a complete organ set, which is really interesting. Okay, moving on to the arthropods. So arthropods include insects and crustaceans. So arthropods have bilateral symmetry, and they actually comprise 84% of the Animalia kingdom. Arthropods have an exoskeleton made of chitin. Sorry, the end's covered up here. They have jointed limbs and segmented bodies, also organ systems, and an open circulatory system. So what an open circulatory system means is that they actually have a heart that pumps blood into their tissues, and that just diffuses back throughout their body. So it's kind of like a simple version of our circulatory system. So the easy ways to identify these arthropods is that they have these jointed limbs and also their exoskeletons. So those are 2 ways that it'll be pretty easy to basically see any arthropod and identify it as such. Okay, the echinoderms, they have bilateral symmetry, and in some cases they'll have this 5-part radial symmetry. So you can see a starfish, you cut it, along any of these 5 planes, and you're going to have symmetry along those. So the echinoderms are exclusively marine animals, so they all live in the ocean. They have a rough, spiny body, and this is a pretty easy way to identify them. If you see an ocean creature with this rough body and spines, it's probably an echinoderm. They also have organ systems and a true body cavity, and they have tube feet. So if you've ever seen a video of a starfish like walking along the ocean floor, it's actually really interesting if you've never seen this, but they have all these little tiny tube feet that they use, and they kind of just move really fast and like scoot the starfish along. And then we come to the chordates, which includes humans. So chordates contains all vertebrates, although not all chordates are vertebrates, but a lot of them are. So chordates have bilateral symmetry and they have organ systems. And one of the defining features of chordates is this notochord, which is a cartilaginous skeletal rod that supports the body. And so in often cases, this is a backbone or spinal column, and that's in vertebrates. So this group, again, includes mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish. And so probably most of the biodiversity that we tend to think about on like a daily basis. Okay, so that wraps up kingdom Animalia. And so in terms of the characteristics of these things that, are particularly important to remember, basically you'll want to be able to choose kind of like a couple features that you could use to distinguish any group from another. So for example, if you needed to distinguish between all these worm groups, then maybe for the platyhelminths, you pick the fact that they're flatworms, and the fact that they have this soft, unsegmented body. So you could use that to distinguish them from the nematodes, which are roundworms, of course, but then they're unsegmented. And then the annelids are, again, cylindrical roundworms, but they have segments and a true body cavity. So, in each case, just kind of pick a few distinguishing characteristics and remember those about the particular group, and that'll help you to identify organisms within that group. Okay, so now we're moving on to the kingdom Plantae. So this contains all plants, of course, and plants are multicellular eukaryotes with chlorophyll. Plants have cell walls made of cellulose, and they're sessile, which means that they're not free moving, so they're stuck in one place. Plants are autotrophs, which means that they're photosynthetic organisms. They synthesize their own energy from the sun. And plants can undergo either sexual or asexual reproduction. So there are 4 major groups that make up all plant species. These are the bryophytes, or mosses, the phyllocinophytes, or ferns, angiosperms, which are flowering plants, and gymnosperms, which generally have like what we call the word gymnosperm actually means naked seed. So you can think of things, pines, with like pine cones, and then cycads and ginkgos. So all of these have sort of this exposed seed structure. Okay, so first of all, looking at mosses. So bryophytes includes mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. So these are non-vascular plants, and that actually distinguishes them from the other categories of plants. They lack true roots and leaves, so instead of roots, they have rhizoids, and these serve to anchor them, perform the root function. And they generally live in a moist environment. And so it's probably, fairly easy to identify a moss based on its features. You guys have seen a lot of mosses, of course, but the important things are that they are non-vascular and that they lack true roots and leaves. Okay, moving on to phyllocinophytes, or ferns. So these are vascular plants that reproduce using spores. And so this is one of the defining characteristics of them, is their spore-mediated reproduction. So they do have roots, stems, and leaves. Their leaves are also, often called fronds. And the spores are produced from their leaves and not from flowers. So these are not flowering plants. Angiosperms then are vascular plants that all of which have flowers at some point in their lives. So a lot of trees are angiosperms as well, and they may not have flowers all the time, but they will flower at some point, basically when they need to reproduce. So angiosperms have roots and leaves, and they can include flowers, trees, and grasses. And so the defining characteristic of angiosperms, again, is the flowers and the fact that their seeds are enclosed within an ovary, which is often a fruit. Okay, then moving on to gymnosperms. So Gymnosperms are similar in many ways to angiosperms, except basically how they reproduce. So they're vascular plants with naked seeds. So their seeds have no shell or cover around them. Gymnosperms are pollinated by wind. They don't have flowers. They do have roots and leaves, and they can include pines, conifers, cycads, and ginkgos. And so these are various examples of gymnosperms in this figure. Okay, going to move on now to the kingdom fungi. And so fungi are multicellular and unicellular eukaryotes with no chlorophyll, so they're heterotrophic. They have cell walls that are made of chitin compared to plant cell walls, which are made of cellulose. Fungi, like plants, are sessile, so they don't move around. Again, they're heterotrophic, so they do not photosynthesize. They're mostly decomposers, and so they, they get their nutrients through consumption. Fungus can use sexual or asexual reproduction, and interestingly, fungus are actually a lot more closely related to animals than plants. So that's something that you might not intuitively think. They, kind of looking at them, they look and act a lot like plants, but in terms of their metabolism, which is kind of a more defining feature, fungi are a lot more. These include mushrooms. So mushrooms are of the Basidiomycota phylum, and these include mushrooms, toadstools, and puffballs. So these produce a unique fruit body, and they release basidiospores, and they typically reproduce sexually. And so these are, a variety of mushrooms here. Then yeasts include the Ascomycota phylum, which is used in baking and brewing. So many yeasts are unicellular and some are multicellular. Yeasts have various morphologies, and they reproduce by budding and fission, which is asexual, or they can also undergo sexual reproduction through the production of an ascus. And so this is one of their defining features, the ascus, which is why they're called ascomycetes. Molds then are microscopic and microcellular organisms. So these have long filaments called hyphae, and they reproduce by making spores, which is similar to ferns and one of their distinguishing features. And lichens then are super interesting because lichens are actually a composite organism. So what a lichen is an algae or cyanobacteria species that lives among filaments of multiple fungal species. So basically this is when one algae or cyanobacteria comes into a mutualistic relationship with one fungal species. So multiple fungal species and multiple algae or cyanobacteria can do this, but each one is a particular relationship. So this is kind of similar, to eukaryotic cells with their mitochondria. And so you should, so these belong to different phyla within the fungal kingdom. So it's not just, one particular organism that does this. And then their reproduction can be asexual or sexual, which is spore-based. Okay, so you can use these slides and then as well as the macrobiodiversity specimen slides in order to complete today's lab. And that's it for today.